All right, notes 2 here. Use this for questions 25 through 39, like you can see, which is due April 8th before midnight. All right. Obviously, we're talking about Watergate, which has just become a big part of our lexicon, just how we speak about any kind of scandal, especially political ones. They just put the word gate on the end of it, and people know, oh, that must be, salacious. That must be something that was supposed to be behind the scenes, people weren't supposed to know about. So, Watergate's become part of the lexicon. I threw this quote up here too. Listen, what the president can or cannot get away with under the Constitution is really left up to Congress. You're never going to see really a president be taken out of the White House in handcuffs, walked, in front of cameras with cops. Like, that's not how it's going to work. Congress has the power to impeach and then maybe kick out a president. And Nixon is going to be a really good example of how that process works. And then later on, towards the end of the second unit that we're going to do, we'll talk about Clinton, which will be another one. Um, but it's really up to Congress to punish or kick out a president and bring, charges against them. And so this is what Watergate's all about. Here's how the whole thing started.
Car 727, car 727, open door at the Watergate office building. Possible burglary. See the security guard.
Are you sure you want us? 517 is closer and they're in uniform.
They're getting gas. You take it.
Unit 1 to Unit 2. Unit 1 to Unit 2. What? We're home. Base 1 to Unit 1. Base 1 to Unit 1. We have some activity here. Silence is advised. Shut it off. Base 1 to Unit 1. Lights on the 8th floor. Base 1 to Unit 1. Is there anybody there? There's people. People on the balcony, armed people. Base 1 to Unit 1. Base 1 to Unit 1. We may have some problems. Someone's here. Hold it! You must hold it! Police! Put your hands up! Drop that jacket!
So that's really all it took to really bring down a president in the end. It's called Watergate, and this is the Watergate complex, since that's where it happened at. It's both a hotel and also there's offices, and so the Democrats, as in the party, put their national headquarters at this new complex there where the offices were nice, and those five guys broke into it and were trying to steal some documents and specifically wiretap it so that Nixon and the Republicans, this is an election year in 1972, could basically listen in and stay a step ahead of whatever the Democrats were planning for that election. Basically, it is Nixon trying to ensure that he's going to get reelected. And this goes back to 1960, remember, when he really felt like he got cheated in his loss to JFK, either because of the debates or because of maybe fraud in Illinois. For all kinds of reasons, he doesn't trust the natural process of the American people voting and letting the whole election process work out and him to win that. He basically wants to make sure I'm going to stay president and I'm going to do what I can to do that. All right. So that's really where all this comes down from. Um, Now, initially, people did not think this was that big of a deal. They thought, oh, okay, well, five dudes that don't want the Democrats to win, tried to break in and wiretap and whatever. Okay, so some shady Republican stuff going on there, but I mean, nobody ever dreamed that Nixon would have been behind this or would have known anything about it. And so I threw this quote up here, right? Basically saying, hey, do I take some responsibility? I guess. I mean, I'm the president and I'm basically the head of the Republican Party in that sense in 1972. So, yeah, I mean, it's my responsibility to figure out what this was all about. But am I guilty? No, no, because I didn't know anything about this. I had no connection to it. We'll figure out who these five guys are. We'll figure out what they were doing, and we'll bring them to justice, like it says. But I'm not guilty because I didn't know. So that's going to be a strategy throughout all of this: is deny, 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 deny. So a couple things happen though, because this just really comes and goes in June of 1972. Still a lot going on, right? There's still protests about Vietnam. We're trying to get the heck out of there still in 1972. There's social issues and, all the stuff that we talked about. Okay, but these two guys, all right, Bob Woodward, Carl Bernstein, a few months pass in the summer of 72, and they're, like, maybe we should just keep looking into the story. Maybe, there's more to it if we keep digging deeper. Maybe we'll find out some more of the motives of these guys, and, who knows who might be connected to all this. But I don't think even they ever dreamed that it would go all the way back to Nixon. They get a little bit of help, right, later on that year. Two big things happen. Okay, one is right, it says right here, the FBI basically gets documents and has informants and people, and they figure out that, okay, the people behind the break-in, Nixon's committee to get reelected that year, they did know about it. Okay, now that's his committee. That doesn't mean Nixon knew about it, but his campaign committee to get him reelected, the fundraising, right, the propaganda, the commercial, the setup of speeches and all that stuff, they at least knew about it. Okay, um, but that doesn't mean Nixon necessarily did. So again, people are like, oh, hey, man, maybe there's some higher up people doing some stuff. But again, still nobody thought, oh, there's no way Nixon is connected to this. Okay, but it does keep the question in people's heads. Okay, um, similarly to that, the other big tip that these two reporters get is that someone calls them and says, hey, can we meet up, at some, I don't know, forget, sometime at night, in some place in DC. I think it was actually in a parking garage in DC. And he doesn't want to give his name. Okay? And so they ask him, okay, well, what should we call you? And he says, well, there's no nice way to say this, but call me Deep Throat, which was a popular porn movie in the 70s at that time. Yes, I did try to find the creepiest picture of this guy that I could, so you are welcome for that as well. Okay. But he basically meets up with these reporters and tells them, we know that not only Creep knew about the break-in, but there were some people really close to Nixon in the White House that work with him like every day that were behind it. They're the ones that ordered it. They're the ones that gave the authorization. Does that mean Nixon knew about it? I don't know, but people really close to him did. Um, and so we had no idea who this guy was. It wasn't revealed, and nobody knew until 2005. And we figured out it was William Mark Felt, or he actually came out and said it then, because enough time had passed that wasn't a big deal. Um, but he really wanted anonymity for a long time. Why would he call himself this? Well, this was a very long, 2-year investigation, and I think that he was actually smart to call him that, and the reporters were smart to call him that because whenever somebody said those words, it caught people's attention, and then they had that association with, oh yeah, Watergate, oh yeah, that whole break-in thing. Hey, again, there's a lot going on from 72 to 74, and by having this kind of I don't know, striking thing. You go, oh, this guy named Deep Throat. Oh, okay. Well, that reminds me. Oh, yeah, Watergate. It just kept it in people's minds, all right, for that long period of time. So, thing is, 1972 is an election year, right? That's the whole point about all of this. Nixon is trying to get reelected and stay a step ahead of the Democrats. Now, I don't even think he needed, clearly, to break in and figure out what they were doing. Nixon destroys in 1972. Okay, he wins. And people don't really have Watergate really in the back of their heads. It doesn't seem like it, at least when they go to vote in 1972, because Nixon wins and wins big. So I don't think they don't think of him as a cheat. They don't think that he rigged anything. They don't. I mean, that just wasn't in their heads. Even with that information from the FBI and from Deep Throat and whatever, it's like, well, Nixon, nothing's been tied to him directly, so I feel okay voting for him. And he's drawn us out of Vietnam, and we don't want to screw up that process by bringing in somebody new. And they just want to keep it going. Um, Congress does decide to look into this, though. Okay, one of the big powers of Congress is that they have what's called oversight, and they can basically call in government workers or even just regular citizens too. So those people that worked close to Nixon, right, they can basically issue a subpoena to them, make them come into Congress, right, and get sworn in, like John Dean is here under oath, and then ask them questions to figure out what's going on. Okay, they can do this to the executive branch. It's one of their big powers of them. Now, I will say this in the impeachment trials in the last couple of years, and I don't know what you think about the impeachment of Donald Trump and all that stuff, but a lot of people that Congress called in basically refused to come and do this. They defied the subpoena, and the courts pretty much decided not to do anything about it. In 1972, when this was coming down the pipe about Watergate and Nixon, a lot of people stepped up and went in there and spoke bluntly and told the truth about what happened and what was going on with Nixon, when I'm not sure that they necessarily would have had to back then either. What I'm saying is it takes some bravery to do this, especially with Nixon and his plumbers and all the blackmail tactics that he had. I mean, people wanted to stay on the good side of Richard Nixon. And yet, for John Dean and these other four guys that resign to step up and go in front of the Senate and say things that they know that Nixon's not going to be happy about, that took some guts. And the big revelation from these, I mean, there's several, but one of the biggest ones is that they say, listen, I don't necessarily know what's on these tapes, but I can tell you that Nixon started having audio tape of conversations in the Oval Office between him and his aides and his campaign managers and people that work in the White House starting in 1971. So if there are plans about Watergate being spoken of in the Oval Office by Nixon or by people that were close to him, it is probably on audio tape somewhere. You might want to get those. Now, why the heck would Nixon start taping people? Well, he wants to use it as blackmail for them later on. He thinks that taping this stuff is actually like an insurance policy for himself, right? This is how he gets dirt on those people, or how he can come back and get those people, that might be talking to the media or whatever. I mean, it's his own paranoia, and it comes back to bite him because I don't think he ever dreamed that what he said on these tapes would come back to bite him. It was about what I can get other people to say. It backfired, in other words. So Nixon will deny till the
And I
end.
want to say this to the television audience. I made my mistakes, but in all of my years of public life, I have never profited from public service. I've earned every cent. And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
President,
Yes, sir.
So he is defiant. Well into 1973. Um, you know, this is on national TV, like it says. Not going to give up the tapes. You can see here this cartoon drawn with these on top of the White House. But really, for the next year, right? That happened in July of, I think, 73 when they find out there's tapes. For an entire year, Nixon's going to refuse to give them up, and more stuff is going to come out. And there's going to start being a lot of public pressure and say, well, listen, if you're not guilty, why don't you prove it? Why don't you hand over the tapes? It's like, well, I don't need to give over the tapes. I have this thing called executive privilege where the president does not have to give things to other branches of government for the sake of national security. I don't have to do this. And people are like, well, okay, that might be true, but by not giving up the tapes, like, aren't you looking more guilty? So he's really stuck. And in July of 74, this is the big ruling, right? When the U.S. versus Nixon, pretty much, because people basically opened up a lawsuit and sued him for him. The Supreme Court says, actually, it does not fall under executive privilege. We are issuing a court order, Mr. President. You need to turn over the tapes to the investigators, to the prosecution in this case. And this is when Nixon knows that to do this, he's going to have to hand over evidence, but to not do this, he's also going to be violating a law. Okay, so either he's breaking a law by not turning him over, but if he turns him over, he's going to be having, be found out he's guilty of Watergate. He's stuck. And so, when he still won't give him up, the House then can start passing articles of impeachment. Now, to impeach a member of the government, especially a president, just means that you are charging them with a crime. Well, by not handing over the tapes, Nixon was defying a court order and therefore obstructing justice and therefore committing a crime, right? Or, being in contempt of court or, whatever the specific law says, maybe both of those. But this was a reason for them to issue articles of impeachment. Now, they never fully get, like, the final vote doesn't get passed. It's kind of a several step process. So in the list of presidents that have been impeached, quote unquote, Nixon is not one of them officially. It is just Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump. But Nixon surely would have. But instead, he basically says, I'm just going to resign. I'm going to quit. And he gets on TV, and everybody is astonished at this. And he just says, I resign the presidency. All right, I'm done. I'm walking out. Now, here's the thing. By doing this, by resigning and giving up your powers as president, he's actually opening himself up to more legal troubles. Like, now, since he's not president anymore, cops, investigators, like, they could literally go arrest him and put him in handcuffs and do all those things. Like, he doesn't have the protection of being the president anymore from the law. It's not just up to Congress, it's up to the regular courts and judges and, all that stuff as well. Except that clearly there was a deal in place. And his vice president, Gerald Ford, soon after gets on TV and does this.
Therefore, I, Gerald R. Ford, President of the United States, pursuant to the pardon power conferred upon me by Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, have granted, and by these presents do grant, a full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon for all offenses against the United States which he, Richard Nixon, has committed or may have committed or taken part in during the period from July 20, 1969 through August 9, 1974.
So clearly they made a deal. Nixon says, well, I'll resign, and that way my Vice President Ford can pardon me for any and all crimes. And this is right here, when he took office, and this is when he resigned. So basically, any moment where he was President of the United States, he's pardoned of anything he did. It's a full-on, like, clean slate. People did not like this at the time. Okay? Felt like he was getting away from justice. This is a loophole in our Constitution that we have never actually fixed. Remember, originally in our Constitution, Vice President would have been whoever got second place in the election. So first place became president, second place became vice president. They did not run as a duo. Okay? But we figured out after our first two elections that that's not really a good system, since now we have political parties and the two people, whoever gets first never gets second, usually are opponents, right? That would mean that Hillary Clinton would be Donald Trump's vice president right now. Not a good system, all right? So we fixed that in, I think it's the 12th Amendment, and said, okay, now president and vice president are going to run as a duo. But we never fixed that loophole of, well, the president has pardon power. So now if you are buddies with president and vice president, well, if a president resigns, what's to stop the vice president from just pardoning them of their crimes and giving them a jail-free card? Nothing. Whereas if they were opponents, then that probably wouldn't have happened. But so we, fixed something in the Constitution, but it kind of opened up another problem that we've never actually addressed because it would take another amendment to fix that. So Nixon resigns and clearly said, hey, Ford, if I resign, pardon me. And then this whole thing is done. Okay? And this is kind of what Ford had to say about it. This wasn't popular, but he's like, listen, it does us no good to see Richard Nixon go to jail. What good does that do? Nothing. Okay? Let's just end this. Let's move on. Okay? Nixon will go away and we can just, try to put this all behind us. All right. So this is our last slide here. Ford will only be president for, about 2 years, actually, about a year and a half, actually. Okay. Like I said, he's a likable guy. Americans like the fact that he was the vice president and yet had no ties to Watergate. Like to think, oh, Gerald's a stand-up guy. For him to be innocent and all that shows, kind of what we like about him. He's a good dude. He wouldn't do the things that Nixon did. However, they don't really respect him as a leader. Okay? And there's always a suspicion now that Nixon's not in jail. Nixon's at home, sitting in his mansion somewhere. He can call up Ford every single day on the phone and say, hey, Gerald, do this. Hey, Gerald, do that. And that was the sense that people got, like that he was just Nixon's puppet. You pardoned him, and now you're basically just, finishing his presidency. It's not Nixon himself, but it's you, and you're basically an extension of him. I don't know if that was actually true, but that was that was what people's idea of it was. Didn't help also that he tripped down the stairs at Air Force One and, was bleeding from the head. But hey. All right, so that is it for notes 2. All right, continue to take care of yourself and get these questions done.